Were there any fringe science theories in the 20s and 30s that inspired Lovecraft and Howard to come up with these ideas?
So we have 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension. Well, what would a 4th spatial dimension look like?
Ancient astronaut theory?
Howard was doing that in 1932.
Is it magic or is it archaic alien technology?
Is this really some sort of supernatural thing? Is it some sort of ancient super science? What is really happening here?
Hello, fellow barbarians, and welcome to the official Conan the Barbarian podcast. I'm Sean Curley, and wow, today's guest, Jeff Shanks. Jeff is a super cool guy. He is a lifelong fan and scholar of Robert E. Howard and Conan the Barbarian. He also just so happens to be a real-life Indiana Jones. That's right, he's an archaeologist, and he has a passion for the mysteries of the unknown. We're going to talk all things Conan, but we're also going to talk about the pseudoscience and weird esoteric ideas back in the 1920s that inspired Robert E. Howard to create the Hyborian Age. Guys, things are about to get real. Buckle up. Throughout the years, there's been countless incarnations of the character. But in your opinion, what makes for the definitive version of Conan the Barbarian?
I mean, the easy answer, of course, is the original Robert E. Howard stories. Nobody's really captured the character in any medium. I think that, although there have been great pastiches, some stuff that's really good in various media, over the years, but there's nothing like those original Conan stories. And, in Howard fandom for many, many years, the original Howard stories were very much unavailable. Unless you had the original Weird Tales magazines, they were very difficult to find. There were a couple of attempts, through the 70s and 80s and 90s to publish them. Carl Edward Wagner, who's also a sword and sorcery. He was a contemporary sword and sorcery author in the 70s, attempted to publish a few, and he got a couple of volumes out with the Science Fiction Book Club. But other than that, you mostly could only get the decamp versions that were, sometimes we over-exaggerate, like the Howard purist fans, just how much DeCamp edited them, but he did soften them around the edges a little bit, right? It really wasn't until the early 2000s, it really wasn't until the early 2000s that the original Howard texts were available, and reading them in the order that Howard wrote them as well, right? Rather than in a, artificial chronological order of like Conan's career, you really got to see what this character was all about in a way that I couldn't even as a kid, right? I was an adult before I really and truly read the original true Howard versions of these stories. And it was eye-opening. I mean, it was absolutely eye-opening. It was, you could, excuse me, you could really capture, they were rougher, they were raw, they were very much a product of their era, the 1930s, right? Writing in the early 30s, the Depression. And you get this character that is, he is not, he's morally ambiguous. His morality is somewhat ambiguous, right? He's got his own sort of self-morality, right? But he is a thief. He is a pirate, a bandit.
Conan plays so many various roles throughout these stories, and I also really love that Robert E. Howard published all of these adventures in non-sequential order. One takes place when he's in his teens, and then the next, he's a king in his 40s, and it just bounces all over the place back and forth. And as a reader, it's kind of like experiencing someone else's memory, or like a past life.
Or it's like him sitting at a bar as an old guy recalling his tales right back. And, oh yeah, remember the time I did this. And you can see that in the stories. Well, he'll even do a reference, right? So you'll have something like the Scarlet Citadel, where he meets a character in prison. Oh, I remember you when you were Amra and a pirate on the Black Coast, right? Well, and then the very next story, he goes back in time, and it's a story of, it's Queen of the Black Coast with, and so you'll get references, and then he'll follow up on that, in the next issue. And so the regular readers of Weird Tales, where they were originally published, this pulp magazine, they would have caught that, right? Because there were a lot of regular fans reading it every month, and, they would have seen how he was doing that. And so getting that experience of reading him in that order, rather than the way they were published in the 70s and 80s, the Sprague de Camp version, where the camp tried to put them in an artificial, this is the career of Conan, right? So it almost creates this artificial epic, like here's Conan, and we can trace him from a lowly thief all the way up until he becomes a king. And in a sense, what he's doing is artificially trying to turn it into this epic fantasy tale, right? Which isn't what the stories are really about. They're much more personal. They're much more, this is an adventurer who's, made his way, through the world, someone who is, a fish out of water in many cases. And yet he's a fish out of water that figures out how to operate in this world he's not used to. He's the monkey wrench in the cogs of civilization often in the stories, right? But, but he finds a way to make it work. And because of his barbarism, because he's not a product of decadent civilization, he's able to succeed in the way that people within that milieu can't themselves, right? And that is what makes it so interesting, makes it so amazing.
All of Conan's adventures take place in the Hyborian Age. Now, what is that? It's Earth, before recorded history. So it's basically like a civilization that is lost to time. With that being said, back to you, Jeff. Can you elaborate on the Hyborian Age? What inspired it? What is it? And what are your thoughts?
Howard, in my opinion, doesn't get enough credit for his world. We think of Tolkien as a great world builder. Howard usually is thought of as somebody who created great characters. Conan, Kull, Solomon Kane, right? But he was an incredible world builder. And the Hyborian Age was his best known sort of secondary world that he created, right? That's the term we use in fantasy literature, a secondary world, right? It's a term coined by Tolkien. But the Hyborian Age of Conan was the end product of about a decade worth of world building that Howard had been doing from the very beginning of his career, in his early 20s. And Howard himself was a big aficionado of history and archaeology and anthropology. He read about all these topics. He read, both mainstream works on the subjects, also more fringe works on the subject, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. Lewis Spence was a big one. He was a big Atlantis proponent. He read occult works on, Atlantis and Lemuria and fantastic civilizations, in addition to reading more traditional works on ancient history, he was very much into. And so what he was doing was creating a fictional version of our world of, everything takes place on Earth, right? The Hyborian Age it's not some magical fantasy land or another planet or anything like that. It's a fantastic era, a lost era within our own history. And that's what he was creating with the Hyborian Age. A lost time, roughly at the end of the last ice age, where there were a number of civilizations that have now been forgotten, and they only survive in snippets, in names and mythology and legend. And that's the Hyborian Age of Conan. That's what he was trying to create.
Let's talk about what inspired Robert E. Howard to create the Hyborian Age. I mean, I know back in the 20s and the 30s, there was a ton of buzz about lost civilizations like Atlantis, right?
So, let's back up a little bit to the end of the 19th century, right? Because there's a couple of things going on there that would have a huge influence on Robert E. Howard, on Bob, on H.P. Lovecraft, on Clark Ashton Smith, some of his contemporaries, all these guys that were writing in weird tales and bouncing ideas off of each other. All of them were drawing on several lines of thought that were coming out of the late 1800s. And so you had a couple of books that are significant for this. The biggest one is probably Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly. It came out in 1882. And this was one of the first books that really, at least in the modern era, right, the last, 150 years, to put out the idea that Atlantis, Plato's idea, concept story of Atlantis might have been based on something real. And he was certainly the first to really popularize that idea. People had speculated before that. He was the first one to truly popularize it with this book. It was a huge bestseller. huge influence. It's where you get a lot of the ideas, what we call diffusionist archaeology. There's pyramids in the old world. There's pyramids in the new world. Well, they must have come from Atlantis in between, right? Those kinds of ideas, that all comes from Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis book. I got it. First edition back here in the bookshelf, right? Also, a few years later, there was a 2-volume set called The Secret Doctrine that was published by a woman named Helena Blavatsky. And she was one of the founders of the Theosophy movement. And Theosophy was a sort of what we probably today call the sort of proto-New Age thinking. It was the beginning of kind of esoteric thought, popularizing ideas, mixing sort of Western esoteric and Hermetic philosophy with Eastern traditions, so you're getting reincarnation and all of that. But she read Donnelly's book and she kind of ran with it. And she was talking about, different past, races of mankind. There were Lemurians, right? Lemuria is like the lost continent of the Pacific, kind of like an Atlantis in the Pacific, Atlanteans and, different races and stuff like that. And so she was popularizing sort of an occult, esoteric version of Atlantis and Lemuria and these lost continents. And again, cataclysmic, there were great cataclysms and the earth was changing all the time, right? And these are all ideas that would go on to heavily influence the first real generations of what we would today call science fiction and fantasy writers, speculative fiction writers. Edgar Rice Burroughs was heavily influenced by them. Abraham Merritt, who's another early pulp writer that people forget, but was a big influence on Howard and Lovecraft and all of these guys. They were heavily influenced by Theosophy. And then when you get into the pulp writers in the 20s and 30s, like Howard, Lovecraft, and these guys, they were eating this stuff up, right? They may not have believed it all, but they recognized, man, this is great material for fiction. And they would talk about it in the, we've got their letters writing back and forth. Oh, you got to read this Theosophy book, by this guy, Scott Elliott, on Atlantis and Lemuria. And, Howard and Lovecraft, they reference some of these books in their stories.
I believe the popular depiction of the lost continent of Atlantis is that of a technologically advanced civilization, with flying jet skis and dinosaurs and everyone's talking to dolphins. What I really like about Robert E. Howard's depiction of Atlantis is that it's not technologically advanced. In fact, it's basically like a big old island of barbarians.
Right, barbarians. Even maybe he calls them barbarians, but he describes them even as Stone Age, like even, less primitive than that, right? So that idea comes from a man called Lewis Spence. You mentioned him earlier. He was a Scottish folklorist and mythologist. He was fairly mainstream guy, at least early in his career, until he got into Atlantis and started going down that rabbit hole. Nothing will destroy your career faster, right, than doing that sort of thing. And he came out with his first book in, I believe it was 1923, called The Problem of Atlantis. And what Spence was trying to do, ironically enough, was move away from that Blavatsky Theosophy idea of a highly advanced Atlantis. He was trying to get back to, maybe there's something to this, but let's ground it more in reality. And he started looking at, again, sort of the end of the last ice age and the end of the Paleolithic period, where at the time it seemed like Cro-Magnon man, right? Today what we would call early modern humans, right? That's kind of, Cro-Magnon's kind of an outdated term, but Cro-Magnon man, right? This is, early modern humans in Europe. It kind of looked like they sort of appeared out of nowhere at the time, mostly in Western Europe, like Spain and Western France. That was where most of the sites were. And so he came up with the idea that maybe Atlantis was real. Maybe there was this, continent, or land bridge in the Atlantic that's now sunk, but it wasn't some crazy high civilization, of the Theosophists, but let's ground it in actual archaeology. What do we have? Well, we have Stone Age civilizations at that time. The Cro-Magnon man seems to appear out of nowhere. So maybe that's what they are. Maybe they were on this continent Atlantis, and all of a sudden the survivors migrated into Europe, right, and displaced Neanderthal. And that's where Cro-Magnon man comes from. And if you don't know better, in the 1920s, this seemed almost plausible, and Howard, clearly read Spencer's books because he heavily borrowed from this and seems to have really liked this idea. That doesn't mean he didn't also love the more fantastic Atlantis of the Theosophists with its ancient they had sorcery and black magic and, advanced cities and all that kind of thing. So when he started creating what would come to be called the pre-cataclysmic world, right? This fictional world before the Hyborian Age, right? It was the world of Kull, Atlantis, right? For those of you that are familiar with that character. Before Atlantis is sunk, before Lemuria has sunk, he borrowed both from Lewis Spence's concept of Atlantis, but also from the Theosophical advanced Atlantis. And he made his Atlantis the Stone Age Atlantis of Lewis Spence. He took the more advanced, Atlantis, and he put that on the mainland, and he made that the Kingdom of Volusia, right? Which is where Kull ultimately comes from Atlantis. He's one of these Stone Age barbarians. He ultimately becomes king of this advanced, civilization on the mainland, Volusia, which was roughly based on the Theosophical version of Atlantis. So he took both versions and kind of combined them into this one, into one world, essentially, where you have a mix of both high civilization, but also Stone Age barbarian civilizations as well at the same time. It's kind of a unique idea, right?
So Robert E. Howard was obviously influenced by lost civilizations and all the fringe science theories surrounding that. But was he also influenced by ancient astronaut theory?
Yes. I mean, the short answer is yes. Lovecraft was playing with similar ideas, right? But for Howard, the most obvious story that's very much in what we would later call an ancient astronaut story, like Von Daniken, Chariots of the Gods, in the late 60s, is a very popular book, and that's where that sort of popularized the modern version of that, right? But yeah, Howard was playing with that idea early on. The story, The Tower of the Elephant, is a great example of that. It's a Conan story, early Conan story, where Conan encounters this alien being called Yog-Kosha. And he's described as having a humanoid body, but his head is more like an elephant, right? It's often in artwork, they depict him as just a human with an elephant head. If you read the story, though, really what Howard was trying to do, it was this alien creature that had big ears and a long proboscis, and on all of that. And an elephant is the closest thing that he's able to compare it to, right? But really, he should be a little bit more alien than he's often depicted, by artists. But he's encountering this ancient alien being that came from another planet, the planet Yog, and came to Earth thousands of years ago. In fact, he came during the age of Kull, and he saw, even before that, right? And he saw, the previous Thurian age of Kull and Atlantis and Lemuria sink, and he saw the rise of the Hyborian civilizations, and he'd been there all this time, and he'd been in the East, and he'd been worshipped as a god. This alien, treating him as a god, right? And he ends up. You realize as you're reading this, if you really put some thought into it. So yes, Howard's encountering this ancient alien, but it's even more than that, right? This character Yog-Kosha, who is worshipped as a god in the East, is a prototype for the Hindu god Ganesha, right? Yog-Kosha, Ganesha, this elephant-headed deity, right? And so Howard is playing with this idea. It's referred to as euhemerism, and that's an ancient, Greek word, for the idea that the gods and goddesses in mythology are just based loosely on true events in the past, that have, or kings and heroes in the past that have become, turned into gods and myth and legend. That's what Howard's doing here, sort of a pseudo euhemerism. He's creating this fake idea. This is where the modern god Ganesha, it's really just a remembrance of this alien deity, this alien that came, down on the planet, Yog-Kosha, that was worshipped as a god for a while, right? That's the same basic premise that you get in Von Daniken and Chariots of the Gods, decades later, and that you still see on the Ancient Alien show today. That concept that ancient people, the gods that they were worshiping, were really aliens. Howard was doing that in 1932.
Was he the first author to be toying with that idea of ancient astronaut gods?
I mean, you kind of get it with the Call of Cthulhu, a couple of years earlier by Lovecraft, but Cthulhu, I mean, yes, he's alien, but he's really more this like extra dimensional kind of entity, that's sort of worshipped. You kind of get the concept there, but not in such an explicit way, the way Howard does, where he's literally saying, yes, this modern deity that people worship literally comes from this particular alien, back in the past, right? Nothing so explicit as that.
So in Lovecraft's work, the old ones, the gods like Cthulhu, are ultra-terrestrial entities existing in a dimension parallel to our own. This also crosses over in Howard's work in stories such as Veil of the Lost Women, where Conan refers to the devils of the outer dark. I'm curious, were there any fringe science theories or esoteric beliefs going around in the 20s and 30s that inspired Lovecraft and Howard to come up with these ideas?
Well, yes and no, right? So you had just had Einstein come out with his theories, right, in the early 1900s, and the concept of time, being a fourth dimension, right? But so it got people really talking about, well, okay, so we have 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension. Well, what would a fourth spatial dimension look like? And a lot of people were, during that period, like toying with this idea, what would a fourth spatial dimension look like, or a fifth dimension, whatever you want to call it, now that time is the fourth dimension. There was a book in the late 1800s called Flatland that was very popular, and it was kind of an intellectual exercise on trying to imagine what a fourth spatial dimension would be like. And it's basically Flatland is a 2-dimensional world. And people that live in this 2-dimensional world, like on a piece of paper, let's say you drew a circle in it, right? And you had somebody living on that piece of paper that's just 2-dimensional. Us in our 3-dimensional world, we can look at that piece of paper and we can see this person and we can see this circle, right? And to that person on the piece of paper, that circle would just look like a line in front of them, right? But we can see that it's actually a circle, and we can take our finger and we can put it down outside the circle and they could see it. We can put it inside the circle and they wouldn't see it, right? We could stick our hand all the way through, or our finger all the way through Flatland, and all they would see is this disc of flesh, getting wider and shrinking, right? They're not seeing the whole picture, right? They're only seeing part of it, whereas we from this higher dimension can see these things, right? So a lot of people, especially in early science fiction, started playing with this idea. So it was out there both in regular science and real science, but also in fringe science and in early science fiction. People were playing with this idea of what would higher dimensions be like. And it was a popular topic during that period, for that reason. Einstein had just come out, was blowing everybody's mind, and so early science fiction writers and Lovecraft was very much into this, playing with these ideas,
It's really fun to revisit all of the classic Conan stories with that perspective. Is it magic or is it archaic alien technology, right? Even outside of the Conan series, like Solomon Kane, his staff being older than the earth itself. Well, obviously that thing belonged to an ancient alien, Are they gods or are they ultra-terrestrial beings existing within another dimension?
And you see that in his stories, maybe more so than Lovecraft, right? Where he kind of leaves it up to the reader to decide what's going on here. Is this really some sort of supernatural thing? Is it some sort of ancient super science? What is really happening here? And Howard was reading a lot of the stuff. He was reading a lot of esoteric literature, and today, again, what we would call sort of, proto New Age, type stuff in Eastern philosophy. He was very much into reincarnation. Of course, you see that in a lot of the stories. And this was very popular during this time. And so he was incorporating these ideas into his stories, extra dimensional entities and things like that to some degree, but he always couched it in terms that leave it sort of unexplained, right? He doesn't try to explain it away, which is what keeps it from being early science fiction, in a lot of ways. He keeps things vague. You don't really know. Sometimes you don't really, are the gods real in the Hyborian Age? You're not really sure, he leaves it kind of open and vague sometimes. And that's very much intentional on his part. Was that really something of the gods, or was that just a trick of the priests doing something, right? Because he himself was a very cynical person. He's very cynical, certainly about organized religion. he was more of a self-described agnostic. Unlike Lovecraft, who was an avowed atheist and very much a materialist, Howard at least kind of left the door open, and was interested in more, Eastern mysticism and things like that. At least he's at least open to the idea, I think.
Here's a good quote from Conan that kind of sums all of this up. I know this. If life is an illusion, then I am no less an illusion. And being thus, the illusion is real to me. I live, I burn with life, I love, I slay, I'm content. So he's basically saying like, hey man, I don't know what's going on here. Is it real? I don't know. Am I real? Maybe. But all that matters is that is real to me.
That's all that matters. Which is an interesting contrast to Kull, right? And you read some of the Kull stories, especially like the Mirrors of Tuzun-Thun and things like that, where Kull himself, a few years earlier, is much more introspective, much more interested in trying to understand the nature of reality and exploring, these ideas. The Kull stories, and that was a period where Howard himself was really starting to get into some of these ideas, and you see that in the late 20s. You see that in the Kull stories. By the time you get into the Conan stories a few years later, it's a lot more grounded in reality, and you do have to wonder, is that Howard himself? Maybe he kind of like moved on from that stuff and was becoming more of a realist, I think the answer is probably so, just based on reading his letters and stuff during that period. So you can sort of see in these characters Howard himself exploring like sort of these greater philosophical ideas. You can kind of trace that through the stories themselves, where Howard was at in his own mind. Thinking about the nature of reality, the nature of the universe. It's kind of cool.
So Jeff, you're a real life archaeologist. Did Robert E. Howard and your passion for uncovering the mysteries of reality inspire that career choice?
100%. Yeah, 100%. It really did, right? So my own background, again, I mentioned I just wrote a chapter about this, and this is what I get into after becoming a fan of all of this material, the Conan stuff, and all of that. As a kid, it also led me to read. Again, as a kid, things like Von Daniken, Chariots of the Gods, and, those of you that are old enough to remember the show In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy in the late 70s and early 80s, right? That had every single mystery you could imagine, Atlantis and Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster and Amelia Earhart, all of that stuff, Bermuda Triangle, like all of these things. Yeah, right? I watched that as a kid religiously, and it completely warped my brain, right? So I love all of this stuff. This is something, I enjoy studying these topics almost nowadays from an anthropological perspective, right? And how these, all of these ideas, appear in popular culture over the years. And of course, I focus on the pulp era and Robert E. Howard, right? And how these things influenced him. But for me personally, yeah, I love this stuff. I was into it all, UFOs, everything, paranormal stuff, all of that, right? And when I got into college, I really in the mid 90s, when most of that stuff had kind of faded, by the late 80s, but going into the early 90s, a lot of the, what we today call pseudo-archaeology, or alternative history started coming back. There was the theory that from Robert Schoch and John Anthony West, did the documentary in 1993 talking about the Sphinx because of the water erosion, might be 10,000 years old. And then a couple of years later, Graham Hancock came out with Fingerprints of the Gods, which is a huge bestseller. And I read all of this at the time, and right at the same time, you get in the mid 90s, there's this new thing called the internet. And all of a sudden people could get online and start talking about this stuff. And it really started blowing up, in the 90s. I even did some correspondence, with John Anthony West and some of those folks as I started getting, while I was in college. And I'd actually gotten out of school for a little while and was working and decided to go back in. And that's when I decided to get back in and get into archaeology. And I was recognizing as I'm, hearing all these theories, I'm like, man, this is just the stuff Robert E. Howard is writing about. This is the Hyborian Age, and it's even more so than people even realize. And as I got into it more, I started to realize it's because a lot of the people like John Anthony West and Graham Hancock and these guys that are promoting these ideas of a lost ancient civilization at the end of the Ice Age, It's because they're being influenced by the same sources that were influencing Howard, either directly or indirectly. They're looking back to those guys in the late 1800s as well, and they're all sort of drawing from the same sources. Howard was using it for fiction. They're looking at it more from a nonfiction perspective. And, even today, Graham Hancock, for those who aren't familiar, is it's a pretty popular proponent of a lost civilization, at the end of the Ice Age. Now, the most recent version of his hypothesis is that this civilization existed, an advanced civilization at the end of the Ice Age, right before what we call the Younger Dryas period. And I'm going to take a second to explain this because it's going to come back to Howard, and it's a pretty cool thing. So for those who don't know, we had an Ice Age, right? Yes, the Earth started warming up, around 11,000 years ago. Things started warming up. And for about 1,000 years, things, the world was warming, the glaciers were shrinking, ice was melting. And it was the beginnings of what would become the Holocene later on. And then all of a sudden, everything froze again. We had a mini ice age again for about 1,000 years out of nowhere. Everything got cold again all of a sudden for about 1,000 years, and then started warming up again. And it is a weird event, right? And there's a lot of hypotheses to try and explain it. Right around the same time, that's when you get the extinction of a lot of the megafauna, the mammoths and the saber-toothed tigers. It's a little overstated how, they really didn't all become extinct at one time. But, something did happen there, right? This weird climate change event where everything got cold again. So Hancock is proposing this lost civilization that he sort of equates with Atlantis, right? Or at least, an Atlantis-like civilization existed in that period right before whatever happened to make everything freeze again. The popular idea now that he's going with is that it was a comet impact or a meteor impact. That's a very controversial idea. There are some mainstream folks that do support it. A lot of people don't. It's very controversial still. But that's the idea that there was a comet strike and that caused everything to freeze up again, right? Now, Howard, if you read his Hyborian Age essay, his sort of world-building essay, he talks about this, right? After the great cataclysm that sinks Atlantis and all that, you have the rise of these civilizations, at the end of the Ice Age, the Hyborian civilization. And then at the end of the essay, those civilizations collapse. The Picts invade and the Turanians invade and everything collapses. And then all of a sudden he mentions, and then the glaciers come again, right? There's another mini Ice Age and another minor cataclysm before you get the Neolithic period, and from there it's regular history. So Howard's Hyborian Age is essentially the same lost civilization that Graham Hancock is proposing here 90 years later, right? I don't think Graham Hancock realizes that his lost civilization is the Hyborian Age of Conan, but it basically is, right? Because it's because Howard was also hearing about the same thing, that Younger Dryas period I was talking about, that last little mini Ice Age, had just been discovered a couple of decades earlier, and people were just talking about it in Howard's time. And, so it was right there. And there was this idea that was kind of floating out there, mostly in esoteric circles, that there was maybe this homeland in the Arctic that was there when things warmed up, and then all of a sudden the glaciers came back and it drove them south, and, that was the end of that civilization. Howard was playing on that same idea. It's kind of remarkable that, these things kind of come full circle. But it's because they're both drawing on those same late 19th, early 20th century sources. That's pretty cool.
In your career as an archaeologist, have you ever investigated anything that would be considered fringe or controversial?
Yeah. I mean, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is a big one. There are some mainstream people that are supporting this idea. It's the problem is the more and more evidence we come up with, it doesn't seem to fully answer all of the problems with that Younger Dryas. I mean, I've excavated sites myself from that period, and here in Florida where I work, and we've looked for it. We've taken samples to look for some of the the signatures of an impact, because I'm I'm not going to not test it, even if it's controversial. Let's look for it. Let's see, So the idea is that there was a comet or meteor impact, or the comet broke up in the atmosphere right around that time, and created multiple smaller impacts, around the globe, which led to sort of the equivalent of a nuclear winter, for 1,000 years. That's the basic premise behind it. And but and in some sites you do get what seem to be markers that could be that, but there's other things that could explain it as well. Like, lots of volcanism, volcanoes erupting could do similar things. And, part of the problem is we don't see those markers all over the globe like you would expect if it were some sort of large event like that. I've looked for it in our sites. We don't seem to see it in the southeastern United States, for example. So if it's that localized, it's probably not an impact, right? Definitely something weird happened during that period to cause this climate change event, but none of the hypotheses out there really fully explain it yet. And that's the thing. It's okay to say we don't know. We just don't have the evidence yet to come up with a really conclusive, explanation for it. There's a number of competing hypotheses, none of which are fully satisfactory. Graham Hancock kind of latched on to this one because it fits with his other hypotheses, for a cataclysmic event. And he has a tendency to do that, to sort of cherry pick, and he has a tendency, he starts with a foregone conclusion, and then he goes and he looks for evidence to support it, right? Rather than, really what you should do is start with your hypothesis and then try to falsify it. You should, try to come up with ways to debunk your own hypothesis if you really want to test it. And, that's not something he does, and that's fine. He's not really, following the scientific method, but that's the flaw in his reasoning. And, so that's one of them. Obviously there have been, Göbekli Tepe is a site, that obviously gets a lot of press. That is because it is making us change our thinking about the way agriculture came into play and the beginnings of large societies starting to form and becoming stratified and that sort of thing. And it's changing the way we some of our older models and things like that, which is good, right? That's the way it's supposed to work. It doesn't make it all of a sudden turn into Atlantis. It's just that we're getting a better understanding of what earlier societies may have been able to do complex things without necessarily having agriculture first. But even the stuff with Göbekli Tepe, this site in Turkey that's been people can Google it. We don't want to get too far into the rabbit hole. It's a very impressive site. It's absolutely, but even now, as more of it's being excavated, we're starting to realize, okay, it may not be as much of an outlier as we thought. We're starting, and then everything changes. The more evidence you get, you change your model. It's the way science works. It's an ongoing process. And, people like Graham, try to, frame it as, aha, there's something new. And so all of the archaeologists, they were all wrong. And now, they're blah, 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 blah. Well, I mean, well, yeah, you get new evidence, you change your old models to new ones. That's what you do. And who do you think found Göbekli Tepe and changed our models? Archaeologists. It's like, what do you, so you can see the frustration on our part. It's like, you're framing what we're doing in a way that's really more sensationalist. And that's annoying. I followed Graham's career from the beginning, since the mid 90s, very closely. I've been, and I've seen even how he's kind of undergone changes over the years and how he presents his stuff, and now he's kind of bitter now. And it's more in some ways about showing that he wasn't wrong rather than trying to really figure out what's going on. And then that's, there's, when it was 95 when that came out. It's been almost 30 years now of this, so I get it. He's bitter.
So you got Marvel, you got DC, but way back in the 20s and 30s, Robert E. Howard created one of the first shared universes. Can you give us any insights into that?
So one of the things people don't understand, I think, about Howard's world building and the world that he created, it's truly a shared universe. That's a term that we take for granted today. Everybody's trying to have a shared universe. After Marvel did their thing, everybody wants one, right? But Howard was doing this in the 1920s and 30s. He was, one of the first writers to really start taking his characters and name dropping things from one story or one series in another series, and ultimately, he really went very explicit with this for the story that came out in 1931 called Kings of the Night, when he actually had a crossover with two of his series characters, Bran McMorn and Call of Atlantis. And Bran McMorn is the king of the Picts during Roman times, fighting against the Romans. And Cull of Atlantis, existed 100,000 years ago, travels forward in time to fight alongside Bran McMorn against the Romans in a crossover story. Again, something we take for granted. It happens in comic books all the time. But this was 1931. This was before comic books were even invented. Howard was doing this. Very few other writers were doing that sort of thing at the time, and nobody was doing it as extensively as Howard was. The Solomon Kane stories, he visits a lost outpost of Atlantis, and he mentioned some of the gods of Atlantis that appeared in the Cull stories. Later on, Howard was writing more of the kind of Lovecraftian stories set in the modern era of the 1930s, and he had sort of a cult detective, a cult archaeologist, Conrad and Kirwan, and they have a story called The Haunter of the Ring, where they find the Ring of Thoth-Amon from the Conan stories in the 1930s. So, Howard was absolutely playing with this idea that all of his characters existed in this vast timeline of history, right? That's really what he was creating. He wasn't creating a fantasy world. He was creating a fantastic timeline of human history and following all of these different characters throughout this timeline and, using elements in those stories, tying them all together. He was creating this vast tapestry, this vast chronological tapestry that his characters and his stories, regardless of what genre they were in, they all fit in there somewhere. And even to the point where you would have crossovers. It's, again, something we take for granted today, but Howard was a pioneer with that. Howard and his Howard verse. It all started back then with him.
So when Savage Sword of Conan was coming out in the 70s and 80s, I can only imagine how cool that must have been to read those magazines as they were coming out as a kid. What was that like for you?
The first time I picked up Savage Sword, as a kid, and it was almost like forbidden fruit, right? This adult version of Conan. And, I was still pretty young at the time, probably 11, 12, something like that. And I remember the first issue, it was in the early hundreds. I think it was maybe like 120 or something like that. And, that, man, this was real Conan. This was more like the Robert E. Howard stories. It was violent and it was more adult, than the regular monthly comic. And, it just had a different level. And, the black and white art was, that was so cool. It allowed you to have allowed the artist a little bit more freedom, with shading and things like this. This just didn't get with a monthly, color comic. And, I was already a comic collector at that point. So immediately what I started doing was going back and picking up back issues of Savage Sword wherever I could find them. In those days, it was a little harder to find. It wasn't like today where you could just order it off the eBay. And so anytime I'd go to a comic book store and, we traveling with the family, doing family vacations, and we would go to a new town, the first thing I'd do is, look at the phone book and see the phone book. This was a thing we used to have back in the old days. Find a comic book store. One of the main things I would do is go in there and see if they had old issues of Savage Sword. And so I was buying up as many of the early issues as I could with, when they were still written by Robert E. Howard and the art by Buscema with great inkers like Alfredo Alcala and Tony DeZuniga and these guys. And man, it was an early introduction to what adult comics could be, and it's something we take for granted today in this modern era. We have a lot of adult comics. The graphic medium can be used to tell more mature stories, and often is today. It was a novel thing in those days. And, that's one of the things that makes Savage Sword so special. And, there's especially the early years, right? Those early back issues were great. You get into the 80s and, after a while, there's a few periods where, looking back now, with hindsight, some of them aren't that great now. And at the time, they were incredible. I recently just did the introduction for the next omnibus, volume 9 that's coming out. I did the introduction for that, and that just happened to be the issues that were the ones that I first started reading off the stands as a kid. And so I got to reread all of these stories for the first time in many years. And I'll admit, okay, like some of these might have read better when I was 13 years old than they do today, right? But it was so much better than what was in the regular monthly comic at the time, because it was written for adults. It wasn't just written for kids. And that made all the difference in the world. And it was something special in those days. And even today, people, older fans like me that look back on that era, they'll talk about, I like the Roy Thomas comics and all that. You know what was really great though? Savage Sword. That's what people remember, from that era. And it was, Marvel, came out with several of these black and white magazines, but most of them fell by the wayside. The only one that survived and stuck around, for 200 something issues and made it into the early 90s was Savage Sword of Conan.
And now, super cool, you're actually involved with Savage Sword of Conan. Tell us about it.
As many people know, and by the time this airs, it's probably going to be out on the stands, on Heroic Signatures and Titan is revamping Savage Sword. And not just in name. Like, there have been a couple of attempts to bring it back with the name Savage Sword, but it was just a regular comic. They're bringing it back full magazine size. I got my contributor copy just in the mail the other day. I've already read the whole thing cover to cover. This is it right here. It is thick. It is thin. And with a cover by Joe Jusko, who's a legend. Joe did many of the covers back in the 80s. That when I was reading it as a kid, as a teenager, Joe did most of those covers during that period. And now I'm sharing a table of contents with him. I've got an essay. For me, this is like, it's a dream, right? This is a bucket list to be in, to have a byline in Savage Sword of Conan. It's incredible. I've already read it. It feels like the old Savage Sword. It's a throwback, old school throwback in format, but the material feels modern. It feels updated, right? It's got the same feel to it that picking up that first issue of Savage Sword when I was a kid back in the early 80s, it has that same feel. Even today in the modern era, when we're used to more modern, writing and storytelling, I got that. They just knocked it out of the park. I was so happy. And I got to tell you, I was scared. I was really scared when I heard we're going to do this. I'm like, oh man, we can't screw this up. This is Savage Sword. It's going to be so important to so many people. You got to do it right. And I know there was even some, talking with, the folks who were working on this. I know there was some resistance even, from the publisher, like, do we really want to do it full size? What do we do? No, it's got to be full size magazine, All right, well, what if we just add a color? No, it's got to be black and white. You don't understand. You've got to have the full package or it's not Savage Sword of Conan. And to their credit, Titan, had faith in it, and we've got it, and I've got it in my hands, and it's amazing, and it makes me so happy. I can't tell you.
Let's talk about Thulsa Doom. Now, when most people think about that character, the 1982 movie comes up. But who is the real Thulsa Doom?
Yeah, God, Thulsa Doom's interesting. So, because he's a character that is more significant in later popular culture versions of Kull and Conan. Thulsa Doom was their protagonist in different media. Then he was in Howard's lifetime. So he first appeared in a story called Delcarte's Cat, a Kull story, Kull of Atlantis. And Thulsa Doom is a ancient sorcerer. The first version, he's actually Thulsi's Doom, and it turns to Thulsa Doom in a different version. And he's a skull-faced sort of undead sorcerer. But in the story with Kull, he's almost like he doesn't even really use his sorcery. He uses like ventriloquism and tries to like fool Kull with a talking cat. I mean, it's really kind of weird. He's almost more of a comical like villain, and not even though he's supposed to be like what we would today call a lich, like from D&D, the sort of undead skull-faced sorcerer. And Howard himself, I think, abandoned the story, and it wasn't published in his lifetime because I think he kind of realized, where is this going, and there, in one of the drafts, there's sort of another character called Cthulhu's or Cthulhus, that was he was Thulsa Doom pretending to be the slave named Cthulhus. And later he abandons his call story, and he writes another story with a skull-faced necromancer in it. In this case, he's an Atlantean sorcerer who washes up in this ancient sarcophagus in the modern era, in the 1920s, basically, right? And he ends up basically becoming a crime lord in the modern era. It's basically a Howard's take on the character Fu Manchu, who, a lot of your, the younger viewers here may not even know this character. Sax Rohmer was a sort of a mystery writer, sort of proto-pulp type writer in the early 1900s who wrote a series of stories where the main character was this supervillain, a master supervillain, who was Asian, named Fu Manchu, and he had this secret network of criminals all over the world, right? It's sort of the prototype of the modern, comic book supervillain, right? Was Fu Manchu, and and unfortunately, it was very racist tropes as well with that. But Howard kind of did his own take on that, except his supervillain was this ancient Atlantean sorcerer who's been resurrected in the modern era with a skull face, right? And that's the name of the story, appears in his skull face. Not super original. And right, and his name, but his real name is Cthulhus. So, he created this Thulsa Doom villain for Call. He realized it wasn't really going anywhere, so he kind of abandoned that. But he took that character and kind of reworked him into this modern Atlantean necromancer in modern times, for this, kind of a novella skull face. And that was kind of where Howard left it. When, in the late 1960s and early 70s, when, all of his works were starting to be reprinted in paperback form, and all the Cull stories were reprinted, they published a lot of those previous Cull stories that had never seen print before, including Del Carte's Cat with Thulsa Doom in it. That saw print for the first time in, 1969, I think it was. And then a couple of years later, when the Conan comic with Marvel became so popular, they decided to, hey, let's do Cull as well. And so they immediately brought Thulsa Doom in, because it's a comic book now. You got to have an arch nemesis if it's a comic book. With the Conan comic books, they took Thothamon, the sorcerer, who had only been in a couple of stories, and turned him into Conan's arch nemesis. For Cull, they made it Thulsa Doom, this skull-faced necromancer sorcerer. And, he became the arch nemesis of Cull in the comic books. And, that worked for a while. When the Conan movie was being made in the, came out in 1982, they basically created James Earl Jones's character, the antagonist in the movie. The character is really based on Thothamon more, right? This sorcerer that worships Set, that kind of thing. But I guess they decided the name Thulsa Doom sounded a lot better. So they took the name of this whole, supervillain and turned him into the antagonist, the villain of the Conan movie. But really, it was just a name only. That character is really probably more based on Thothamon from the Conan stories. One of the interesting things, too, during that period is, some people know this, the He-Man and Masters of the Universe became popular in the early 1980s, the action figures on that. Skeletor is almost certainly based on Thulsa Doom, this skull-faced, evil villain who is now a meme, right? The Skeletor memes that are so popular. I don't know how much we're allowed to say, but people that are reading the monthly comic will have seen Thulsa Doom's name mentioned already in print. In, I think, issue 4 of the regular monthly Conan comic. So he's at least been name dropped in the new series. We'll see where that goes.
Is it true that you did an archaeological dig behind Robert E. Howard's house in Cross Plains, Texas?
But yeah, I did a dig out there, and it was an archaeology magazine. It was a big deal. It made a bunch of, so it was fun. You know what we did find? If you go back and look at you can Google it and you'll see all the news stories and stuff. One of the things we did find was this tiny little miniature battle axe. This wee little battle axe. Yeah. Double-bladed battle axe. And it went viral. Like, I shared a picture of it, like, holy crap, we weren't expecting this, right? It goes viral. Couldn't really tell what it was. We brought it out, everyone shared it on social media because everybody was following the dig. It was like a big deal. And we finally got it back and analyzed it. It turned out to be a frog pelvis.
That's so weird.
But it made for a great story, right? It went viral, and it was, oh my God, a miniature battle axe at Robert E. Howard's, cellar or whatever. So yeah, it was kind of fun.
Guys, everybody, Jeff writes all of the essays in the current Conan comic line. If you haven't read them, definitely go check them out. Thank you so much. I look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, sounds good. Let me know when you want to do it again. I'm here. It's a pleasure, man.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Please like and subscribe. If you have ideas for future episodes or guests you want to see show up on the show, up here on the show, let us know and we'll get them. We're on back for more next time.